For us, it's not about sort of what conversations do we shy away from or what do we not talk about. It's more about, are we elevating voices to the extent that there's balance, right? Are we hearing and giving not a both sidesism, kind of perspective, but are we giving the audience different lenses by which to examine an issue or different ways to think about an issue?
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Signal in the Noise. I'm Dan Gaynor, and on today's episode, we sit down with Lorelle Atkinson. She's the Vice President of Communications and Marketing at the Aspen Institute. And in this jam-packed conversation, we cover Lorelle's storied career in government and how she ultimately landed the very cool Aspen Institute job, which, by the way, is a global network of change makers working to solve the greatest challenges of our time. No easy feat. We talk about how Lorelle's navigated the challenges that have come her way, like making a difficult business case internally, getting approval for funding, org design, proving ROI, using AI, and of course, assessing impact with data and with transparency, and how she's managed to redesign her entire team with the mindset of a strategist within the comms function, serving over 60 different programs at the global Aspen Institute. Fascinating story about making change from within to propel a mission outside in the world. So join us for a fascinating discussion here on Signal in the Noise. Hi, Lorelle.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
And where are you beaming in from in the DC metro area today?
I am beaming in from Northern Virginia. I'm in the Springfield area.
So let's talk about you in terms of background first. You're the Vice President for Communications and Marketing at the Aspen Institute. Very fancy organization,
Yes.
Very austere title. You lead the in-house communications agency for the public policy programs and oversee both strategic and editorial direction for the Institute's marketing and brand initiatives. You also lead comms for the Aspen Partnership for an Inclusive Economy. It's a $30 million initiative with MasterCard and Prudential. Before that, you had a government gig in the Obama administration. Seems like we were in similar arenas.
Yes.
You were at the Millennium Challenge Corporation.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about your career arc before we get
Yes.
to your current job. Maybe not to birth, but I don't know, college onward. Walk us through how you got to your very cool platform.
So directly after college, I moved to DC. I actually had an internship that I moved here for, completely on a wing and a prayer. When you're 21, you think you can do anything. And so I came to DC and I thought, I'm going to work in politics. I had no grand plan. Aside from that, I studied international development and relations and political science in college. And so I thought, why not DC? And I came here, didn't have a place to live, didn't have a permanent job. I did that for a couple of months and quickly realized I did not actually want to get into politics. But what I did want to do was policy. And so big difference there between campaigns and policy itself. And so I quickly moved from that internship into an advocacy organization called People for the American Way, and did community organizing for a number of years around all kinds of issues: reproductive health, LGBT rights, Supreme Court issues. Kind of ran the gamut of domestic policy issues in the early 2000s. And then I moved from there to back into international development. So I decided I wanted to really double down on what I had studied in school, and moved to an organization called Women Thrive Alliance, where we lobbied Congress for money to invest in women's economic empowerment overseas. So we really work to integrate women's issues into all of development issues across the board. Women's issues used to be sort of siloed within the development space. And so we made the case to integrate them throughout all of development policy and development programming. So did that for a few years. And then I left there and moved into the government. I worked at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, leading their congressional and public affairs team for a number of years. It was a fantastic look at how the American government works and how we work overseas. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that agency has recently closed, been shut down by this administration, which is, I think, a shame. And so I did that for a number of years. I had a pretty large team. I also had a team overseas. So not only did we have our headquartered team here at the agency, but we also worked with more than 15 country partners. So I had a number of comms folks in each of those countries that we oversaw in international comms within their countries, which was sort of a stretch for me. It was new for me. And I think it really speaks to the power of people believing in you and investing in you to sort of, let me take that leap to do international comms. It was a great experience. I then took some time off and I had my son. And I think this was sort of a turning point a lot of women have. You sort of have your first baby, you've invested all of this time in your career. What do you do? And I took 18 months off. I had been, in the government for a number of years. I had been working nights and weekends, dealing with all kinds of crises overseas. And I wanted time to just enjoy being a mother for a while. So I did that. I took 18 months off.
Which by European standards is just maternity leave.
It's just maternity leave, right? It's just maternity leave. But it seemed like a long time when I was in it, but it was such a gift. And it just, it reminds me how much we shortchange mothers here in the US by not giving them that time to really connect with kids when they're small. It's the best time, I think. Then Aspen came calling, and I was doing a little bit of consulting, and they said, we're starting to do these enterprise initiatives. We're looking at enterprise initiatives, meaning most of their programming had been done program by program at the Institute. We have about 60 different programs. And they wanted to start to look at issues that cut across the entirety of the organization. And what does that mean from a narrative standpoint? What does that mean from a programming standpoint? And they'd never really done communications in that way. So they asked me to sort of come in and help them think about what would enterprise communications look like if it wasn't just communications to support an individual program, but to support the larger brand as a whole. So I started 2 weeks before the pandemic, which, talk about
always looking for a challenge.
Always looking for a challenge. I could never just go into anything easily. So I started in February of 2020 and was sent home 2 weeks later. And I've been there ever since. And we've had a lot of change in the last 5 years at the Institute, especially on the communications side. I've been able to re-envision and reimagine my team. I've been able to rebuild the team. We've completely reorganized and reoriented towards a different way of working at the Institute to really support the larger brand. And it's been an amazing journey. So not at all a straight line from college. I've been kind of all over the place, but it all makes sense in the sum of it.
Well, I don't know. I think you've always had service at your core.
Sure.
You've taken on amorphous situations. I do want to start with the government stuff.
Sure.
I obviously have a strong bias towards this because you and I both served in the Obama administration at agencies that have since been closed down.
Yes.
Putting the politics aside, I would be interested in you explaining not only what MCC did, hate to say it in the past tense, but more importantly, you worked on congressional and public affairs, meaning that you had to make an argument, as I did at USAID, for why we should take American tax dollars and invest it overseas in vulnerable women and girls, in economic partnerships, in sustainability, things like Power Africa, which was creating distributed renewable energy infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
So you and I were on, without knowing each other, similar initiatives that were fundamentally always being questioned in terms of their ROI for the American people. Without making the argument, how did you make the argument? What was your approach?
So one of the things that we really leaned into at MCC was transparency. We were regularly rated the most transparent aid organization in the world. We released all of our data about what we were funding and why. And we also considered ourselves extremely good stewards of the taxpayer dollar. So we were only investing in countries that showed a commitment to shared values with the American people. So things like democracy, things like investing in women and children. So we were not in some of the more difficult countries, I think, in the world that sometimes it can be harder to make the case for. So from a fiscal responsibility standpoint, I think a lot of members of Congress, especially Republicans, we had a ton of Republican support for MCC. It was an agency that was started under George Bush. So, I mean, we came in with sort of a different way of thinking about development. And it wasn't just about aid, it was actually about development. And so that was a lot of the case that we made when we were going in and doing mostly infrastructure. We were building roads, we were building hospitals, we were building schools, and we were looking at what was happening in a country that was hindering its economic growth, what was happening in a country that was preventing the private sector, which we ultimately thought was the key to long-term economic development, from coming in. And so we would do these big assessments at the beginning of each partnership to really determine what was hindering that economic growth. And then that's what we invested in. So it wasn't just that we were handing dollars to a country, we were really investing in that country so that it could get on its own, good footing and grow on its own by encouraging and incentivizing the private sector to come in and start businesses there. So in some ways, our case was not as difficult to make, I think, to lawmakers, but it was difficult to make to the American people, because I think the American people, they're not quite sure about the importance of foreign aid. And, we often talk about development being the third leg of the stool of diplomacy and defense. And we talked about that all the time. And we always sort of tied it to national security in some capacity, because we felt like investing in these countries made the world safer. It made for better consumers also in the long run of American goods. So there were lots of ways that we sort of tackled how to think about the issue that wasn't always just we're helping people overseas, because we found from a messaging standpoint that that was not a good message. That was a hard
Mindful
sell.
that you might not be able to say the most provocative thing. I can. I'm reminded of the quote from James Mattis, who was the famous Marine four-star general, who said, "Please give me development dollars, otherwise I need money for more ammo."
That's right.
And it's a provocative way of saying it's preventing problems before they arise.
That's right.
But nonetheless, I recall from when I would write congressional testimonies on behalf of the administrator of USAID, having a person from Tennessee say, our sewers don't work in my district. Why are you going to spend this money to educate girls in Afghanistan?
Right.
And I always found that to be like an incredibly nuanced argument where it's not about dollar in, dollar out.
Right.
It's instead about painting a comprehensive picture about American values and indeed the value that we get by investing abroad. I want to take this then to the Aspen Institute, because I suppose you do have a common thread in that you take on challenges that are opaque to general audiences. Aspen talks about challenging complex problems and
Yes.
convening a nonpartisan array of leaders.
Yes.
Help the audience wrap their heads around what the value of Aspen is today, how its mission links to this moment, and what sort of programs you're overseeing to further that mission.
I have loved my time at Aspen. It's been such an interesting look at what's happening across the country. We're mostly domestically focused, although we do have some global programming. I like to think of Aspen as a global network of change makers who are working on some of the biggest issues of our time. And I think if you think about it in that way, we have a lot of different fellows who come through our programs. We also have a lot of programs that are working directly in communities. But at the heart of it, it's people who are trying to change the world for the better. Name an issue, and we have a program at the Institute that works on that issue. We have 5 different impact areas that we really focus on: economic opportunity, climate and energy, rising generations, leadership, and societal trust. And the societal trust work that we have been doing, I think, is probably, it's all important, but I think in this day and time when trust is eroding around the country between people, trust in information, trust in institutions, all of it is on the decline. We look often at the Edelman Trust Index, and we see this, over the last couple of years. Nobody trusts anybody and they don't trust anything, right? And so for us, I think this investment that we've made in societal trust is really going to make a huge difference. And it's all about creating the environment for people to come together to have really difficult and hard conversations about the issues of the day that will hopefully lead to progress. And what we have found is that as showing up as a neutral party, as showing up as not bipartisan, but nonpartisan, right? We don't have an agenda. We are really just creating the opportunity for people to come together and talk to each other, which sounds very simple. In this day and age, it is not simple at all. I was giving a presentation the other day talking about the erosion of trust and the rise of this phenomenon called affective polarization, which means not only do I disagree with you because you're on the other side of the political aisle, but I have an emotional, visceral reaction to that disagreement. It now means that I don't like you as a person, right? So the idea that like we cannot just disagree, we now don't even like each other because we disagree. That's a fairly new phenomenon, and it's something that's really getting in the way of people coming together and trying to find any common ground to move forward in this country. So we do a lot of work, we have a lot of programs, but I think at the core of what we do is really to convene those conversations that really, really matter. And we do that in small groups, we do that behind closed doors, we do that in public events, large and small. We do it all over the country in cities, in rural areas. And I really think that that is what our superpower is.
Lowering the temperature at a time when America is spiking a fever
Yes.
is pretty important. I'd be interested in career highlights there. I know that you've built a team and reshaped the organization, so maybe we could start there. Tell me a little bit about how you've revamped things just from the internal machinery, because a lot of the people listening to this are marketing and comms professionals
Yeah.
who are interested in org design. And then from there, what that organization has allowed you to do. I think when we talked last, you name dropped in private, I would say, not publicly. So I'm prompting you, like Katie Couric is somebody you've
Yes.
worked with, or Common, the rapper slash Microsoft ad guy. So do org design and then highlights
Sure,
from your
sure,
time
sure.
at Aspen.
And sometimes I think org design can drive what you're able to actually accomplish externally, right? So I mean, they're both equally important. I have spent so much time on org design, more time than I think I ever have in my career in the past couple of years. And that's mostly because when I took the team over, it was really organized as a service team to each of the programs. So if you think about each program, we have, like I said, 60 programs. Each program has their own theory of change. They have their own goals. They have their own mission. They have their own logo. They're kind of like little independent Aspens within our larger Aspen. At least that's how they were when I first started. And so our team really was sort of in service, almost like a help desk to those individual programs. When our new CEO came on, Dan Porterfield, he had sort of a different vision for the organization and how it was structured and how it operated, which was this idea of one Aspen. We're not 60 programs. We're not a house of brands. We should be a branded house, right? And so, his vision for that really made me think about how do I reorient this team to invest in the larger Aspen brand. And so to do that, we sort of had to go through this long process of looking at what skills do we have? What resources do we have? What are the needs of individual programs vis-a-vis the needs of the larger brand? And through that process, which probably took me maybe 18 months to really get through. I mean, because we're also still doing the day to day work, right? What I did was to create a team that was essentially in two parts. So, on the one hand, we have our enterprise team, which is looking at all of our main brand channels. So, our website, they oversee all of our social channels, all of our editorial work. And then I have a team called Creative Services, which is the in house agency for the programs. And that team is for profit. So that's a fee for service team. And so what we decided to do was I knew that a lot of programs were already outsourcing a lot of their comms work because our team at that point wasn't big enough to be able to handle all of the service requests. And so I did a bunch of surveying and focus groups of our policy program directors to sort of see what they were outsourcing. And then I built a team that could service that for a fee. And that fee is, lower than the fee that they would pay if they went out on the street and contracted out, consultants and PR firms and things like that. So not only did I sort of reorganize the team, but I built it so that we could support the brand while still supporting the programs and then also making money off of that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And what a sort of budget jujitsu
Yeah.
exercise.
And did not increase my budget at all, right? Like, so none of this increased my budget. In fact, it's decreased my budget because we're making a profit on the creative services side of things. So didn't have to increase my headcount either. So I didn't have to go out and hire a bunch of people. I did have a lot of transitions on the team, but same headcount, completely different mission for the organization.
I want to ask you, as somebody who worked from the agency world and also worked in the big house world. I worked at Nike and Weber Shandwick. So I have empathy for both sides. You built an in-house agency servicing, what did you say, like 60
60
different
programs,
programs,
right?
truly a global operation. It saved the organization money while ostensibly offering the agility and the custom approach necessary to deliver great work. How has your experience changed the way you think about an agency model or just outside consultants, let alone like what do you outsource, period?
Right.
What are the things that you still look externally for help? Is it technology and AI implementation these days? Is it design services, documentary making, anything in between? Versus what have you, through building up a team,
Hmm.
been able to develop a muscle for in house? A good example is a lot of people I talk to on the in house side will say, we took over media relations. We didn't
Right.
want to be reliant on having an external party who we pay a monthly retainer have our relationship with the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
So I'd just be interested. That org design has allowed you to take ownership of some things and be
Hmm.
strategic with what you outsource. What are those two buckets?
So there are two things that we decided we would never put in creative services because we wanted programs to have excellent quality and not want them to be scared of a price tag for that, right? That's media relations, right? So media relations is always in-house and it's always free to programs. And then events in our headquarters. We do a ton of events. So event support, we have a production company that I hired. So we used to have a small in-house team of like 3 or 4 people who managed events. And instead I now have a production company that comes in and handles all of our events free of charge to programs. So those are the two things that I knew I wanted to keep as something that programs could have access to no matter what they were doing. Everything else literally lives in creative services, and there's not much that we outsource beyond that. So the way that I structured the model, we have 4 or 5 full-time staff. So I have 2 co-directors, a project manager, and then we have 2 or 3, a writer, social media specialist, and a graphic designer. Those 3 are all full-time, but they're full-time, but programs can hire them out. So we hire out their time. All other certain like requests, whether it's documentaries, video production, any of that, we have a bench of vendors that we work with. And so we have the opportunity, we have freelancers and consultants that we can sort of pull into different projects as needed. We also have PR firms that we work with that we will manage the PR firm on behalf of the program. So anything that you would want as a program that requires any sort of communication support, we either have a full-time person that you can buy their time or we have freelancers that we will manage for you.
It is just a fascinating thing because what you're saying, creative services is the team you
Right.
oversee, and a program like the Aspen Institute Center for Rising
Hmm.
Generations, which I think is supported by the Bezos Family Foundation,
Bezos, yep.
would go to your team and be like, "Hey, we'd like to direct some payment
Yes.
budget internally your way to
Yes.
fund it." And because you have this expertise on what the other programs have done,
Right.
there's no education on
There's no
what Aspen
education.
stands for. I think it's a really fascinating model
There's no
and
learning
truly
curve.
nimble.
And we do everything for them. We can do everything from, logo development to, a 10-minute video, and everything in between. So,
So, keeping in mind that you have to do everything, let's talk about AI and data. On the measurement side of things, how do you evaluate impact on your team?
yes. So we evaluate impact both quantitatively and qualitatively. And it's different depending on if we're talking about sort of impact of the creative services team for programs versus our enterprise team for the brand. But we kind of measure them the same way. So obviously on the quantitative side, we have all of the, vanity metrics that everybody has. We're looking at shares and likes and engagement and all of that. We actually worked with a company called Media Cause to develop a metrics dashboard for us. And so it's a dashboard that pulls from Meltwater for press mentions and press hits. It pulls from Google Analytics for all of our website traffic. It pulls from all of our newsletter. We're in Axios. It pulls from Axios, all of the newsletter metrics, all of our social channels, I think through Hootsuite, and it pulls them all into one big dashboard that we can see and track on a daily and monthly basis if we want. So on the quantitative side, we've done that, and we've also developed those for our programs. So our programs have access to that dashboard as well for their individual program metrics. And then on the qualitative side, we're always looking at things like narrative change. We're looking at things like, is the way that we are talking about an issue and framing an issue showing up that way in the press? Is it showing up that way in the way that policymakers are thinking or are talking about that issue, or the way that influencers are talking about that issue? So we do a lot of social listening. We do a lot of tracking of our media hits to sort of see how we're positioning. Because we have our impact areas, we're always looking at how we're showing up within those 5 issue areas as well. So on the qualitative side, it's, I think, less scientific, if you will, but I think it's equally as important to know that the way that you are shaping the conversation, or at least trying to shape the conversation, is being successful.
And let's talk about the creative services aspect in terms of content generation.
Yes.
It sounds like you use a variety of tools for measurement, some of which have AI built into them.
Right.
But on the creative content side of things, you mentioned logo development.
Yes.
You mentioned partnering with production companies on event stuff. I assume there's a lot of writing, scripting, editing,
Writing.
production of reports, implementing photography, snipping up like an amazing speech from Hillary Clinton or something, or a concert from Common. So, like, how are you using AI?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we use AI probably every day, especially now that we have gotten a lot better at tailoring our content to each platform. I think we used to live in an era where you sort of created once and posted everywhere, right? And, now that we've gotten a lot better at thinking about audience segmentation, and how different audiences consume content, we definitely now produce content per platform, right? So we have lots of different series that we only produce on YouTube, or we only produce on Instagram, because we know what the audience there is looking for. And we use AI to help us write scripts, scripts for intros to videos, to write, all kinds of things when we're posting. So social posts, we'll use AI for that sometimes. If we're doing research, I think AI has been extremely helpful. I think we do it less on the imagery side, on the generative side of things, because we just have such great graphic designers. But because we're putting out so much content, I think it's been great for editing support. We're in the process of redoing our website. So we've had to go through and edit a lot of the content that's currently on our website. We've used AI for that. So, and we use it every day. I'm not someone who is afraid of AI. I think a lot of people, especially in communications, I think people are conflicted, right? They're not quite sure. Should we be using AI? Shouldn't we be using AI? I think, all tools have the potential for good and for evil. So, you just got to know how to use them. But I think, shying away from AI, especially as a communicator, is probably the wrong thing to do.
So you're putting out like an immense volume of
Yes.
messages, and there's so many different programs you mentioned. I think you said something like 60.
Right.
There's new ones that are being added all the time. Everything that I'm hearing from big companies these days is that we feel like we have a target on our back. We
Mm,
feel like as a multinational organization, there's a target on our back for being American. Within America, we feel like corporations are sort of being divided into you're
yeah.
in the inner circle and you're not.
Yes.
And as a result, there's this giant hushing exercise. I think we saw this when we talked together at the Page conference. It's
Right.
okay to be neutral.
Right.
We're about policy, not politics, as if that's truly possible.
Right.
And I guess I'm just wondering, as somebody who's really putting a megaphone to a huge variety of issues,
Yes.
you are invariably going to step into some issue or some frame that
Mhm.
somebody somewhere won't like, that will be politicized, whether you
Right.
like it or not.
Right.
Even if you're, I know Aspen sponsors writers and has
Mhm.
forums for writers. Well, what if
Mhm.
you wrote a book that somebody doesn't like?
Right.
I'm interested in this era of hushing and this era of fear for communicators who basically are doing everything they can to talk less and more efficiently and more safely. You're running in the opposite direction.
Yes.
You do measurement and data informed analysis to navigate these icebergs, or are there some other tricks of the trade that come with producing as much as you're producing and avoiding a ton of backlash and strife?
I think it's a tricky environment. I actually just did a webinar the other day on communicating during difficult times, and we talked about, just this issue, which is, to what extent should organizations or brands be thinking about self-censoring, thinking about changing language? And, ultimately, one of the things I said then is that it depends on your values, but it also depends on your audience and what your audience needs to hear from you. We believe in values-based leadership, which is all about speaking your truth. And so, one of the great things about the Aspen Institute is that we are in a position to elevate all kinds of different voices. And so, for us, it's not about sort of what conversations do we shy away from or what do we not talk about. It's more about, are we elevating voices to the extent that there's balance, right? Are we hearing and giving not a both sidesism, kind of perspective, but are we giving the audience different lenses by which to examine an issue or different ways to think about an issue? And so for me, it's less about backing down or backing away, and it's more about finding that balance.
Makes good sense. I wanted to ask, of all the programs, and I hate to do the thing where you have to
Oh
pick your favorite
no.
child, but I won't ask favorite. I won't ask favorite. But I was just thinking,
Uh-huh.
whether it's the Science and Society program or the Food and Society program or the Henry Crown
Henry
program, which I
Crown
didn't even
Fellowship.
realize was
Yes.
Henry Crown Fellowship, that I didn't even realize was part of Aspen.
Yes. It was our first fellowship.
If you're listening to this and you want to get engaged with Aspen,
Yes.
what are the most fun programs that you should start following? And then as a follow on to that, how should people in general get engaged with Aspen?
Yes. Oh, one of the most fun programs I think is probably Aspen Challenge. Aspen Challenge is a program that goes into different cities and works with high school students. They get together and they pitch ideas about things they want to do in their community, and then they win an award. So there's judges, and the judges will judge the pitches, and then the team will win, and then they'll get to come to the Ideas Festival. We hold an Ideas Festival every year in Aspen, Colorado, which is an amazing event, which is one of the ways I think people can get involved in the Institute if they're interested. But to just see the inspiration of these young people who really have not had opportunities like this before, and they come together and they're thinking about all of the challenges that they're facing in their communities, and they really want to do something about it. And it's an amazing opportunity for them to both think about problem solving and how you do that in lots of different contexts, but then also to get on a stage and present your idea to all these people who you've never met before. So Aspen Challenge is a really, really special program. It's another Bezos Family Foundation supported endeavor at the Institute. We have a number of them, but that's probably the one of the most fun program if I had to name one. Although they're all great, as you know, all the programs are great. It depends on what you're looking for. So we have fellowships, we have programs, we have lots of events, we have seminars. I think probably one of the more interesting things that we do is seminars, which people probably don't really know about. It's one of the things I think makes our brand so unique. So we have what are called executive seminars that you can be a part of throughout the year. And it's really for leaders who are at an inflection point in their career. So they tend to have, maybe they're mid-level in their career, or they're a CEO and now they're not sure what they want to do next. And you spend 5 days in Aspen in a cohort of other leaders like yourself. You're completely off the grid. You are, reading these old world texts, and you're sort of talking about the issues of the day. I think at some point you perform Antigone. I mean, it's a great experience for people who are sort of trying to figure out, what do I do next? Like, what's the next part of my leadership journey? So, anything from Aspen Challenge, dealing with kids in cities who are looking at all of the issues facing their communities, to spending 5 or 6 days in the mountains in Aspen reflecting on your own private leadership journey. We do all of that and everything in between.
I can imagine most people who are listening to this are like, I'm at an inflection
Yeah.
point. I'm inflecting. I need
Inflecting.
to
Come
go.
inflect in Aspen with us. It's
I
great.
need 5 days in Aspen performing Antigone and reading old world text. That is
Yes.
exactly what I need to do instead of like determining, should I get off Twitter and get onto Blue Sky.
Yes, exactly.
One like last question is, and I don't have a better way of putting this, but like, how do I become Lorelle? Like, how would somebody who's listening to this get to the sort of fun, multifaceted position that you have right now? And I don't necessarily mean like, how do I have your job? I mean,
Right,
how can I borrow your approach?
right.
Let me put it this way. What are some key tenets of the comms function of the future that you believe if you were to helicopter into any company from Microsoft to the Red
Yep.
Cross,
Yep.
that you would try to implement some of these lessons learned throughout your career? What is the function of the future?
It's interesting because to be in a creative space, which I think communications is very much a creative space, I'm not technically a creator, right? So I'm not a designer. I'm not designing logos. I'm not a videographer. I'm not producing things in that way. What I am is a strategist. And that is something that has really been a core thread for me throughout the entirety of my career. And so, what I have learned, and I love communications as a field, but really I'm a strategist who happens to do communications, if that makes sense. And so, what I have learned to do with that is to come into a space, really understand the needs of that space, and then figure out how it is we advance and progress and grow in that space. And then I've hired really great talent to help execute on that, right? And so, in my mind, you need both. You need sort of a visionary strategist who can put a vision in place that people can rally around and know that we're all heading in the same direction. And then also somebody who can really hire the team that needs to be in place to execute that. I hire great designers. I hire great media relations people. I hire great videographers, right? And great writers. But I'm none of those things. I am a strategist. And so I think you have to sort of know who you are when you're coming into a communication space like this, sort of pick a lane, be really, really good at that, and then supplement with all of the other pieces that you don't quite do.
I think I've learned a lot both about how to do the job, but also what a cool job looks like. You've got a lot of material to copy here. Thank you so much. How can
Yes.
people who are listening to this get in touch with you? I don't want you to get inundated with emails, but find you on LinkedIn, or what are
Yes.
ways to get in touch?
They can absolutely find me on LinkedIn. I'm extremely active on LinkedIn and I respond to messages. So if you send me a message there, I'll definitely hit you back.
Amazing. Well, this has been another awesome episode of Signal and Noise. Laurel, thank you so much for joining
Thank
us.
you for
And until
having
next
me.
time,
Till next
thanks again.
time.